This is the first lesson on the Cold War. It is Chapter 27, Section 1, Development of the Cold War. Now, the Cold War, the definition is this is a conflict between the communist nations led by the Soviet Union, which is what is modern-day Russia. It was renamed USSR or Soviet Union after the Bolsheviks took over and then later renamed Communist Party, renamed the country. So it was a conflict between communist nations led by Soviet Union and democratic nations led by the US. And we're going to see that this conflict, while it doesn't result in direct military conflict between the US and the Soviet Union, it does take a lot of indirect forms, such as arms races, competitions for alliances, space race, and then proxy war, which examples are Vietnam War, Korean War, Cuban Missile Crisis, things like that, where a war is fought by a third party. Now, the reason for the Cold War is there was this difference in ideologies between the US and the Soviet Union. Now, an ideology is a body of ideas. Now, what we see is the US is in the Soviet Union as they were engaged in post-World War II talks about what to do with Europe post-World War II. There was some conflict over what type of government should be put in place. So the US was in favor of a democracy, free elections, and the Soviet Union is in favor of communism. Now, what we see is some definitions, and so that we can examine how these types of governments vary. So with democracy, this is where the people have the power to elect either directly or indirectly their representatives. They have individual rights such as right to assemble, right to free speech, right to press. And then if we look at the Soviet government, this is also an economic form as well as communism. This is a government characterized by state control of the economy, communal property, equal distribution of goods, wealth, and human labor. So in that system, it is all about the government and the government control. And what we see is common property, meaning no longer individual property. And then what we see is that the people in communism, don't have those rights to political parties or the rights to things like assembly, press, speech. And then in terms of how that compares to the US economy, what we see is one, there's going to be right to individual property, but also individuals and corporations are going to own the means of production, meaning land, capital, which is money to invest, labor, and then also corporations are going to be in control. So not the government, but individuals and corporations. So you can see the differences in their beliefs, the way they structure the government, the way they structure the economy. This is just a little summary of the ideological struggle between the nations. So Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc are going to want to spread communism, and the US and other Western democracies want to contain communism, meaning stop the spread of. Some of the methodologies that we see, espionage, which means spying. So KGB is going to mean translated for Committee for State Security. They're going to function for foreign intelligence, counterintelligence, guarding the border of the USSR from nationalism, dissent, anti-Soviet activities, versus the CIA, which is the Central Intelligence Agency. We're also going to see arms race and then competitions for alliances and control of different countries. This is just a little summary, you don't have to write it down. And then there it is again, the alliances that will be created during this time. We're going to start out by talking about the Cold War in the 1940s. And in order to do this, we have to talk about those post-World War II discussions. So again, in as World War II is wrapping up and post-World War II, we see the big three, U.S., Soviet Union, Great Britain, getting together to talk about how to redraw the borders in Europe. And the Soviet government, the Soviet Union, wants to have governments that are pro-Soviet, that are communist, and they just want that to protect themselves from Western aggression. And Great Britain is going to fear having this rise of communism, but because of the destruction that Great Britain faced in World War II, they were unable to respond militarily, economically, things like that, and so that task was left up to the United States. Now, these terms are all going to refer to the same location. These are all synonyms, might be referred to as Communist Bloc, Eastern Bloc, Soviet Bloc, satellite states, but they're all referring to countries in Eastern Europe that are under the influence of the Soviet Union. And some of the ways that they're specifically influenced by the Soviet Union is they're communist. So we're going to see that they have 5-year economic plans like we saw with Stalin. They're going to focus on industry versus, individual consumer goods. They're going to collectivize the agriculture, which again means no more individual property. It's common land. And then they're not going to allow people to form oppositional political parties. And then they're going to set up ways to control the people, such as secret police or military force to govern and make sure that people aren't speaking out against the government. This is a map of the communist bloc. So the red nations indicate that these were under control of the Soviet Union. So you can take a moment and look at that, look at some of those nations. Next we have this term Iron Curtain, and this is a term that was coined by Winston Churchill. And what this term means, this is referring to not a literal curtain but a figurative curtain, and it is referring to the military, political, and ideological barrier established between the Soviet bloc and Western Europe from 1945 to 1990. So this is the quote where it was taken from by Winston Churchill. So we can see in the east, these are going to be the countries under Soviet control. The west is going to be what we think of as democratic nations, things like that. So this Iron Curtain, this divide, is representing this, it's called, in this case, called a curtain, where it's dividing democracy from communism. In terms of how the U.S. responded, because of course Great Britain couldn't respond, the U.S. was left to respond, they adopted this policy known as containment. And so they wanted to contain the spread of communism, meaning they wanted to stop it from spreading. So think of it as they were trying to put communism into a container, put the lid on it so that it couldn't spread anymore. And a couple examples of containment that we're going to talk about are the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. Now, the Truman Doctrine was adopted in 1947, and the context that we see is there was civil war going on in Greece, and then Turkey was facing pressure from the Soviet Union in terms of becoming another satellite state. And so according to the Truman Doctrine, and this was an idea by President Truman, it was believed that communism was successful where there were economic problems. And the reason for that is the individuals in the country wanted to have that equal access to land and to resources that the government could provide in communism. And so therefore the U.S. saw it as necessary to provide these struggling economic countries with economic aid in order to prevent communism. So in this case, specifically, the U.S. is going to give $400 million in aid to Greece and Turkey, again to support their economies so they would no longer face economic problems, and then communism would be prevented from spreading. Now, the Marshall Plan was similar, but it expanded this. So it's also referred to as the European Recovery Program, proposed by Secretary of State George Marshall. There's his picture. And this, like I said, expanded the idea of the Truman Doctrine and said that the U.S. should provide aid to all European nations that needed to be rebuilt from World War II. And again, this is going back to that idea that if countries are struggling economically, the U.S. should provide them aid so that they can prevent the spread of communism. So the U.S. is going to pledge about $12.5 billion to Western Europe in order to rebuild. Now the U.S. is also going to offer this to Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, but Joseph Stalin is afraid of being put under control of the U.S., and so he rejects it. Now the next thing that we have talked about briefly is Germany and what that looked like post-World War II. Here's a map of post-war Germany, and we'll talk about it in a moment. But at the Potsdam Conference, the Big Three decided that Germany should be divided into 4 zones. And those zones were put under the control of the Soviet Union, the US, Great Britain, and France. So if we look, we have East Germany, which was put under control of the Soviet Union. Then we have West Germany, that was put under control of the British, the French, and the US. And then you can see that they also divided Berlin into Soviet controlled as well as French, British, and American control. Now what we see is by 1948, Great Britain, France, and the US want to unify West Germany and East Germany to create one German nation. And we'll see how the Soviets respond to that. So the Soviets do not respond positively. What they do is they blockade Berlin. So in other words, they prevent trucks, trains, and barges from entering Berlin. So if we look back at that map, they're going to blockade this area so that supplies cannot get from this side to that side. And so what that forces American and British to do is they have to fly in and airdrop, airlift supplies to the people of Berlin. And so you can see the dates of this, July 1st, 1948 to May 12th, 1949. So in order to avoid war, the Soviets go ahead and lift the blockade. And now Germany and Berlin are 2 parts. Next we have the Chinese Revolution, which we've talked about various times this year. But what we see is at this point, Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong takes control of mainland China. He's going to declare it the People's Republic of China. And this declaration will ultimately end the civil war that's been going on between the Chinese Communist Party and the Nationalist Party. And this again makes the US very fearful to see another major country like the Soviet Union, but China in this case, fall to communism. And the last thing we're going to talk about today is the arms race. So arms relates to armies and weapons, and we're going to see that this is going to lead to the Soviet Union exploding their first atomic bomb, and now we have 2 superpowers that have nuclear capabilities. We'll elaborate more on this tomorrow.